Bem-vindos, então, à nona sessão e última do Simpósio Internacional de Filosofia Antiga da UFMG, com a presença de Sylvana, David e Fernando. É uma alegria ter o Fernando como moderador dessa sessão, que já organizou tantas atividades, está ali com o vinho na mão, e no Rio de Janeiro já recebeu também a Sylvana e o David no evento sobre Poética das Emoções, em que eu tive a alegria também de participar. Fernando é professor e tradutor, será publicada uma edição da Apologia de Sócrates, né, ainda esse ano, e trabalhou muito com a Bárbara Cassano, no Dicionário dos Intraduzíveis, e um ativo professor e também um adorador da cachaça e do vinho. Ninguém passa pela sala do Fernando no Rio de Janeiro sem tomar uma dose. Obrigada, Fernando. Sylvana, thank you very much, Sylvana, for coming to Brazil again, even if only virtually. Sylvana is a professor at Ioannina University, where I had the pleasure to be received by her and her, how do I say, centenas de alunos, hundreds of students. And Sylvana is a translator. She translated Parmenides by Plato. She's working on a book on Symposium by Plato. Thank you very much, Sylvana, and I hope you can return again to Brazil to other meetings.
Me too.
David, sorry?
Me too.
Well, David, last but not least, David Konstan, I have to have a special, it's not necessary to present David. He's, like Andrea Serafin said, the master of emotions for us, our dear hero. And David, I apologize for my pathetic presentation, but you know, I have calendars for the last 30 years of my life. And this one is from the year of 2000, when I arrived at Brown. It's this, you can see, it's hard-boiled, great line, classic noir films. And in this calendar, on February 3rd, I wrote, in the afternoon, I have class with Victor Konstan, mathematics and intuitionism, and later I have a dinner at your home with you and Purificación, Pura. And I wrote how glad, how happy I was. I wrote the menu in English to try to improve my English, which is still terrible. It's a lost case. But at the end of this day, I wrote, what else? And this is not like Marco Antonio testament of Caesar in the film with Marlon Brando, that he doesn't have the testament, but he forged it. But anyway, this is true. I wrote, what else? I was blessed by the gods. And I think 22 years later, to say that we are blessed by the gods, and particularly I am blessed by the gods for having so many people here, but also for having you, who was for me, who is an example of not only scholarship, of our master of emotion, but also a person who has such a generosity with everyone who tries so much to improve and to receive Brazilians at Brown and in the United States at APA. And you still now is such a marvelous person that represents, I think, the best in our academical life. I thank you very much, not only for receiving me 22 years ago at Brown, but also for being here with such a generosity in your accepting this invitation. So I give you the floor, starting with Sylvana. Thank you very much, and apologize for my enthusiasm. But anyway, everyone knows that I'm very pathetic.
May I?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, I don't know whether I should continue with praising David. The only thing I want to say is that he is a real Socrates among us, and his generosity of spirit and his fine criticism is a lesson to all of us. I will now proceed to my talk. I will share the screen with you. I will skip some of the my desktop. Okay. Oh. Let's see. Actually, have my desktop. Share. I want to share
Sylvana,
my. Yes.
If you want, one of my assistants can share the text on the screen.
Yes, yes,
Can show the text on the screen.
Okay, I have a file which is under your name, Cecilia.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, Euripides.
Perhaps this is for this reason that it's not shown. But perhaps one of my assistants can do this. Yes, Kai or Daniela.
It's the same paper. Okay.
Don't worry. Daniela will put on the screen, and you just say next page, and we do it. Okay?
Okay. Okay, I cannot see anybody except you. I wish David and Fernando were there. Now.
Yes.
I need to go back to my desktop somehow. Or does she?
I've started sharing my screen, so yours is not available for us now. So you can go back to Zoom and perhaps...
My screen, not yours. I want to share mine, not yours.
Yeah. But you are... Sorry?
Okay, if I'm my co-host, why can't I share my screen?
Oh, yes, you can share your screen.
You are a co-host, you can share it.
Okay. Let me go back. Oh, goodness. Otherwise, what were you suggesting, that I shared your screen?
No, you can just be connected to Zoom, and we are going to share your text, and then you can read, and you can see everyone, and you can see the text. It will be easier, okay? And when you pass the page, you just say, next page. Don't worry. Daniela, por favor, pode compartilhar o texto?
To move my paper as I want.
We can move to you. Te move.
Now, share it. There is okay. I cannot move it. You have to move it for me. This is not practical.
Yes, yeah, but it's the solution.
It will take hours because I have noted on my paper what to omit and what not to omit. Sorry. How can I share my screen? Shall I?
You can do the same thing. You can go in the share screen topic, okay. And then you choose the page
files
that you want to share.
No, there are your files here. How can I share my screen and not yours?
First of all, you are already a co-host. Then goes to share screen.
Yes.
And open your file. It's okay.
In the Dropbox.
Sorry for interrupting. Sylvana, do you have a PowerPoint presentation to share?
No, I have a text, my text.
I see.
Sylvana, have you got your text? Do you have your text open on your screen? If you do, when you hit share, look for your text.
Let me then go out because it's not open. It's on my desktop and that's why I cannot find it. I will, let me see if it's open.
You have to have your text open, and then when you hit share, you will see it listed.
I'll go back and I will leave the meeting and I.
In the meantime, we can drink Dionysus.
Salud.
Just an information, some people ask when we talk about Ovid, next week we start a brief course on Ars Amatoria. And then I put here on the chat, everyone can access and can come if you want. Okay. And about the other meetings, we will divulge and you can have access to all the information. Thank you. I am perhaps ela conseguiu? Sylvana? Sylvana, I cannot listen to you. Your phone is closed.
I'm not a co-host any longer. I think I should become a co-host again.
Yes, you are a co-host now.
Okay. I will share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
And can you see my text now?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, there's only, okay. There's only this part, my goodness. Oof. Sorry.
No, Sylvana, if you want, what you can do is you send this by email to us, your project, but we can start with David and
yes,
then.
Yes, let's start with David. Let's start with David. Sorry.
Okay. No problem, my dear. Just send to me and I will send to the students and we'll project it. And then we start with David. Meanwhile, you organize this, okay?
Actually, I have it, but I don't know if you can see it.
Yes, you can see now.
Okay.
Euripides. Okay.
Okay.
All is well, that is well. Let's go.
Okay, so this is part of a new book, and this is part of a chapter of a book. And it talks about the literary hypokeimenon substratum in Plato's Symposium. And I talk about the Xenophonous elegy in the first part, Euripides in the second, Aristophanes in the third. So when it comes to Euripides, while in Xenophonous elegy, the author Quas Symposius gives a full prescription of the table manners observed in the ideal symposium, In the homonymous dialogue by Plato, the change of the customary course of the banquet is presented as a result of a common agreement among the participants. In both texts, the logodaipnon, banquet of speeches, as Athenaeus characterizes it, following the ritual, should be performed in a state of sobriety. In particular, after Eryximachus' medical strictures against harmful drinking, all the symposiasts agree that they should transform the drinking competition into a rhetorical contest on how to praise God. Eros, for reasons of order and narrative economy, the person who introduced moderation in drinking is also the one who introduces the god to be praised in the banquet of speeches. And this is Eryximachus. And I have the text here. Phaedrus' wish to praise Eros in an adequate manner is introduced by Eryximachus via Euripides' words. After all, this is an appropriate introduction to the occasion which celebrates Agathon's victory in the public contest of dramatic poetry, especially if we take into account that both tragedians ended up in Pella, where they left their last breath, not to mention that in Aristophanes' Thesmophoriazusai, Agathon plays an important role in convincing them not to condemn Euripides to death. As for Euripides' influence on Plato, it is undoubted, and this is what this colloquium was about. Yes?
You can go slow, a bit slowly. It's
okay.
Very fast.
Longer than, okay. The analysis which follows is an illustration of the answer Plato gives to Euripides in the Symposium, following the patterns already set by Xenophanes in his elegy on how to praise God. Indeed, by making use of Melanippes' verses, Plato clearly indicates that the idea to praise Eros appropriately is not his own, but Euripides. And it is indeed in Euripides that this very wish to honor Eros is expressed for the first time, though not in Melanippe, but in the Hippolytus, where Eros is described as Aphrodite's key holder, having a disastrous effect on all persons involved in the drama, beginning with Phaedra, her own follower. Could Phaedrus' name echo Phaedrus in a jeu de mots, especially since Plato repeats the whole set of ideas which is to be found in the choral song of the Hippolytus? And now I quote the Hippolytus. It is folly that the land of Greece makes great slaughter of the cattle by the banks of Alpheus, meaning Apollo, and in the Pythian house of Apollo, if we pay no honor to Eros, mankind's despot, who holds the keys of the sweet chambers of Aphrodite. Likewise, Phaedrus in the Symposium exclaims that we do not honor, not a single man ever essaying till this day to make a fitting hymn to Eros, so great a god and yet so neglected. It is precisely this idea of denying honors to a mighty divinity, which is the very reason for the tragic end of both Hippolytus and Pentheus in Euripides' tragedies. Moreover, this appears to be the fundamental difference between Euripides and Plato's motivation for praising Eros. They both agree that Eros is a mighty god and yet neglected, but in Euripides' case, Eros' greatness is associated with the disaster he causes when he affects mortals. He ruins mortals and sets them upon the manner of disaster when he visits them. In this sense, a hymn to Eros in Euripides is supposed to have an apotropaic effect, warding humans, whereas in Plato, a hymn to Eros should be done as beautifully as possible, emphasizing his kalos rather than his terrifying aspect. We ought, each of us, to make a speech in turn, praising Eros as beautifully as we can. Indeed, in the Hippolytus, Aphrodite, from the very beginning of the play, sets the terms which have a programmatic effect on the whole drama. I quote, "For in the gods as well one finds this strength, they enjoy receiving honor from mortals. For Hippolytus, who does not honor her, disaster is inevitable. Honoring Aphrodite and thus Eros, the key holder of her chambers, offers the key to understanding the dramatic course of this tragedy. Had Hippolytus been respectful of Aphrodite, as he was of Artemis, there should be no reason for the disaster he had to suffer along with the rest of his royal family. Like Pentheus in the Bacchantes, who suffers ritual diasparagmos as a result of ignoring the divinity of Dionysus and treating him as a foreign charlatan, Hippolytus, who despises Aphrodite will be killed in the worst possible chariot accident of his day, only to be redeemed in Plato's Phaedrus as the charioteer of the soul. In the Hippolytus, Aphrodite uses Phaedra, her own devotee, in order to take revenge on Hippolytus. Aphrodite only cares about her own pleasure, no matter what the consequences may be for her followers, while in Plato, Eros is the philanthropos god par excellence, who encourages them to become heroes, even when they are not of noble birth, to quote Phaedrus in the Symposium. Now, I will skip that, and I will go to a comparison between Xenophanes' elegy and the speeches in the Symposium. As in the case of Xenophanes' elegy, the most important reason for choosing Phaedrus first has to do with Phaedrus introducing the subject of the Symposium, which takes us back to verse 20 of the elegy, according to which of all men is he to be praised, who after drinking gives goodly proof of himself in the trial of skill, as memory, mnemosine, and strength will serve him. How does mnemosine and arete serve Phaedrus' logos? A full demonstration is given in this speech. No doubt mnemosine refers to epic poetry, and thus Phaedrus begins his account with a reference to Hesiod's Theogony, then he goes to Akusilaus, to Parmenides, proving that that Eros is the first and the first god. And then he counts the blessings of Eros among men. So not only is Eros the firstborn among the gods, but as a state of mind, he is also the most important divine gift to men, in the sense that he has the power to instill courage and braveness, even in those who are not noble by birth. This has to do with the section arete. The first is the section mnemosine. And in other words, Eros inspires arete even in those who are not agathi by birth, because Eros is by birth the first and hence the noblest among gods and men. Thus, Phaedrus' speech is a demonstration of virtue, and in particular, a demonstration of the highest virtue Eros inspires in men and women alike. In conclusion, the first speech addressed to Eros complies perfectly with the two basic guidelines given by Xenophanes, namely mnemosine, which translates into ephine mythe, derived from the epic poetry, and into arete, which is demonstrated by giving specific examples of the heroic mythology, namely Homeric Achilles and Alcestis, a well-known character portrayed in Euripides' homonymous play, which will be further explained in relation to the Hippolytus. Plato's imagery does not stop at given examples from traditional Greek mythology of epic or tragic poetry. Like Xenophanes, he attempts to actualize the new worship in the political present of his city. Phaedrus finishes his speech by imagining an army and the whole city inspired by Eros and thus composed of couples rather than by simple individual citizens or soldiers. Such a leap of demonstration may envisage an aristocracy of Eros governing an ideal army or an ideal city under the leadership of the new divinity introduced, Eros above all other gods. An image of such a city driven by the heroic inspiration Eros instills in the citizens may hark forward to Plato's Republic, where the bonds formed between the citizens under the instruction of Eros play a more important role than family bonds within the traditional oikos, as shown by Alcestis in the homonymous drama by Euripides, to which Plato makes an explicit reference in 180b. Unlike Eros in tragedy, Eros in the city, which is the best drama according to Plato, does not cause disaster in families as in Euripides' Hippolytus. Rather, he becomes a hegemon and a strategos, as Eryximachus will call him at the very end of his speech, which is intended to complete Pausanias' speech following on Phaedrus' speech. And then I have the text. Now, in response to the first speaker, who praises the god as the firstborn unique Eros, the second speaker will speak of the god in dual form, and thus of two distinct erotes, In Plato's Symposium, the participants are not presented as a whole, as it is the case in Xenophon's Sympotic Elegy, whose main representative is the poet himself. Rather, they are introduced one by one, selectively. The order of presentation thus becomes a key for understanding the structure of the dialogue, which has a different function from that of the elegy, of course. In the elegy, we are given the layout of the logodeipnon by the main participant, the poet himself, who gives instructions of how to perform it. Whereas in the dialogue, there is a full demonstration of and hierarchy of the presentation of the participants explains why the second speaker will not speak of eros in the singular as the previous one, but in dual form. Now, it is noteworthy that in the second speech, both theogonic myths concerning Aphrodite may find a direct correspondence to the Athenian cult, especially since the speech will end with a praise of the Athenian institutions concerning the right behavior towards erastai, as opposed to other Hellenic and barbaric regimes. Indeed, according to the archaeological findings, Aphrodite was worshipped in Athens in both aspects, namely under the epithet Urania. You can see that in the altar exposed in the Acropolis Museum, as well as under the epithet Pandemos. Consequently, if there are two Aphrodites by birth and thus two Erotes, the question that remains to be answered is which of the two is worthy of hymnic praise, since this is the purpose of the logodeipnon at hand. And then I quote the passage that you may find in the footnote. The very idea that all gods are worthy of praise is central in the tragedy Hippolytus. It describes the axiom Aphrodite sets at the very beginning of the play in order to account for condemning the protagonist to death. Indeed, Aphrodite plots against Hippolytus not only because he does not honor her as he should, but also because he considers her to be the worst among gods in the sense of vulgarity. Kakiste daimonon, as opposed to Artemis, whom he considers as the supreme goddess, megiste daimonon, in the sense of chastity, as will be discussed. Hippolytus' critique of Aphrodite echoes Xenophon's critique of the epic poets, who present their gods as being worse than humans in the sense that they deceive each other. Indeed, in this play, Aphrodite introduces her devoted adept, Phaedra, to deceive her husband, Theseus, only to take revenge on his son, Hippolytus, who refuses to honor her, unlike all mankind, seeking a superior fate to other humans. This is what Hippolytus is about. What will be further discussed is how Plato transformed the tragic paradigm of Eros in Euripides in order to show that what is condemnable by tragic standards in the Hippolytus is to be praised by philosophical standards in the Symposium. Like Euripides in the beginning of the Hippolytus, Pausanias in the Symposium speaks of two distinct goddesses. Unlike Euripides, they are homonymous, while embodying different, if not opposing, principles in the drama. Although they both bear the name Aphrodite, they differ in the sense that they are associated with different kinds of Eros according to their genealogy. Urania on the one hand and Pandemos on the other. However, it is noteworthy that in the Hippolytus, it is Artemis and not Aphrodite who is called Urania, heavenly. Not only in this verse, but in other verses as well. While Aphrodite does not introduce her for the toponymic Cypris, which has a purely geographical significance related to where she was born and not to her father, as it is the case in Pausanias' speech in the Symposium. On the other hand, what Euripides stresses from the very beginning of the play are the main implications of her name when she presents herself as uk anonymous in the sense of polyonymous, especially when combined with the adjective pole, the first term used by Aphrodite herself in the first verse of the play. Mighty, pole, and of high renown, cook anonymous among mortals and in heaven alike. Besides, this is precisely the reason why Cypris considers Hippolytus to be at fault, since he does not want to conform to the many, seeking a superior fate to other humans. Another instance where Euripides plays with the implication of Aphrodite's name occurs in the Trojan women, where he ascribes to her the name Aphrodite. For every folly that men commit, they lay upon this goddess, and rightly does her name begin the word for Aphrodite. Aphrodite as Aphrodite, senselessness, is far from being worthy of praise. She is rather an object of reproach as humans blame on her all senseless actions, a statement which again recalls Xenophon's critique against the representation of the gods by humans. No wonder then that in the Hippolytus, the same term is used to describe Phaedra's illness as caused by Aphrodite, the term Aphrodite, I mean. Although the state of Phaedra's Aphrodite appears to be related to Artemis, as she is the goddess of birth pangs, this is the only passage in the tragedy that accounts for women's senselessness in purely physiological terms. Women's nature is an uneasy harmony, and with it want to dwell the slack, unhappy helplessness of birth pangs and their folly. This explanation is ambiguous inasmuch it could be attributed to any of the two goddesses for different reasons. However, it is noteworthy that Phaedra herself does not associate her mania, madness, a term synonymous with Aphrodite, to Artemis, but to the daimon who induces ate, emanen, epeson daimonos ate. The demon causing ate can only be Aphrodite herself, especially if we consider that the nurse later repeats almost verbatim to Phaedra that it is indeed the wrath of the goddess that has descended on you, the word wrath, or gai, being a synonymous with the word ate. Likewise, Plato in Socrates' speech considers Eros to be a daimon rather than a god, while in Agathon's speech, he compares Eros to Ate, walking over people's head and driving them mad without realizing it because of her softness. As it is the case with Ate, it is in Eros' nature in and out of souls. Now, what is important is, which is the epitome of tragic error, that the sensible suffer in spite of themselves, as the nurse says, falling in love with disaster. They fall in love with disaster, and this is what will be further debated in the Symposium, where two Eros under Ioannina and Aphrodite cannot desire disaster, but only the supreme good. Now, in the Hippolytus, both Phaedra and the protagonist are indeed destroyed because of the goddess fury, who instills senselessness even in the sensible despite them. In the beginning of the play, both the nurse and the chorus praise Phaedra for her sophrosine before his suicide. Not to mention that Phaedra herself claims that by her act, she means to teach a final lesson of sophrosine to Hippolytus, who has committed hubris against goddess Aphrodite. However, until the end, Phaedra plays Aphrodite's part and acts upon the goddess's will, admitting her defeat by the goddess when she realizes that her passion is stronger than her sophrosine, and there is no other way to appear a sophron except death. Another instance in Euripides where Aphrodite leads the sophron heroine to death is to be found in Alcestis, also praised by Plato in Phaedra's speech in the Symposium as the paradigm of sophrosine and genaiotis par excellence imputed by Eros. However, in the play, the fact that the heroine takes willingly her husband's place, Admetus in Hades, out of love for him, is challenged by her father-in-law and considered as a senseless act. What does he say? What does Pheres says to his son? For you have Admetus, for you have lost, as no one will deny, a noble and virtuous wife, Sophron. And then he changes it into, she was not shameless, but senseless. However, Plato in the Symposium seems to draw upon Euripides when he celebrates in Phaedra's speech the example of Alcestis, who accepts to die in her husband's place. More precisely, this example is set as an illustration that the bond created by Eros between the lovers is superior to any kind of relation, even between parents and children, which is proved to be the case in Euripides, not only in Alcestis, but also regrettably in Medea. Alcestis is honored by the gods precisely because she gives her life to save her husband's life, unlike his father. Now, the notion of senselessness becomes even more significant both in Euripides and Plato, especially since its opposite, namely Sophrosine, is central both in the Hippolytus and in the Symposium in relation to honoring the gods appropriately. Now, in both cases, is always related to honoring the particular goddess. And Sophrosine to both goddesses is synonymous to reverence towards them. El Sophrosine metapseveias. And in this respect, it appears that reverence is the key to human Sophrosine to both goddesses. Nevertheless, reverence towards Artemis represents a different sense of Sophrosine, if not the opposite of showing reverence to Aphrodite. To Artemis, as she tells Theseus, Aphrodite's real target was Hippolytus Sophrosine itself, his chastity, despite her using his refusal to honor her as an excuse to revenge on him. There's a text on that. Indeed, in Aphrodite's case, Sophrosine is synonymous to honoring her and recognizing her power, although she drives her most devoted adepts from Sophrosine to Aphrodite and thus to disaster, as revealed by the paretymology of her name in the Trojan women. On the opposite, devotion towards Artemis is demonstrated only in terms of chastity. Aphrodite is indifferent to the disaster that she causes even to her own adepts in order to please herself, while Artemis strives to protect her devotee from Aphrodite's wrath even on the last minute, and moreover, she asks him to forgive his father for being also a victim of Aphrodite's revenge on him. In short, Aphrodite in Euripides represents the disaster side of Eros for humans, whereas Artemis is philanthropic towards her adepts and the generation of Sophrosine in them without seeking any other recognition from them. In this sense, Artemis complies with the definition of Eros given by the first speaker in the Symposium as the philanthropic god par excellence who imputes virtue on them in the sense that she completely embodies, and in this sense, she completely embodies Aphrodite Urania in the second speech given by Pausanias, not to mention that Artemis' character as a goddess provides us with a key to a new kind of reverence in another Euripides play, namely Iphigenia. I will not analyze Iphigenia here. Hippolytus is also utterly convinced that he embodies the paradigm of Sophrosine, and he says that he is virgin in the soul. This is what makes him. Makes him virgin in the body, as you can see in the previous text. Being virgin in the soul is what makes Hippolytus virgin in the body. The priority of the soul over the body sounds Platonic in the sense that it goes back to the Orphic tradition. We have many Orphics in the background, which is emphasized in the Hippolytus when Theseus accuses his son of being an adept of Eros. We all know this verse. Furthermore, in the Symposium, the priority of the soul over the body is reflected on the distinction between the two Aphrodites, Pandemos on the one hand, who pushes her adepts to sexual intercourse, and Urania on the other hand, who craves for the soul rather than the beloved. Unlike Urania, Aphrodite Pandemos is not worthy of praise because she does not contribute to arete again. Indeed, the term Pandemos itself is in direct juxtaposition to the first kind of Eros Phaedrus explores in the speech, who instills courage and excellence to men and women alike, in the sense that it creates a new aristocracy in the polis and the army. And Pandemos, on the other hand, is to be identified with mighty Aphrodite in the Hippolytus, who extends her power over all people indiscriminately. This lack of discrimination is what Plato emphasizes in order to discriminate her from Urania Aphrodite. Thus, the basic features of Eros Pandemos stemming from Aphrodite Pandemos are that it is directed to both women and young boys and seeks pleasure in the body rather than in the soul. On the other hand, Eros Uranians avoids females, seeking such males as are noble and nearly mature in mind and body, exactly like Hippolytus, who shuns the bed of women while venerating Artemis, the goddess of chastity and hunting, her favorite activity, which he performs with the male companions of his age. And this is what he most desires, to continue doing that. What is remarkable in the previous passage that I quote, and that you may find in the footnote as well, is that Hippolytus identified the two main causes which prompt men to deprivation of Sophrosine in the name of Aphrodite, namely sexual desire for beautiful women, along with love of tyrannical power. Those are indeed the main themes developed by Plato in the Symposium in Pausanias' speech. Yet Plato subverts the tragedy when he recognizes in Uranian Eros the only remedy to tyrannical power. Indeed, Pausanias recognizes in the tyrannocide's Eros the divine courage leading to the emancipation from the tyrants who seek power over freedom and who do not allow for the development of real bonds of friendship between the citizens. We could put into peril their dynastic authority, as it is the case with the barbarian regimes. The antidote to tyranny is no other than philia, created through philogymnastia, love for sports, and love of wisdom, philosophia. Those practices strengthen the citizens who exercise them so that they might fight against any tyrannical regime, and those are indeed the practices that Hippolytus prefers over tyrannical power. Similarly to the first speech, where Eros creates an aristocracy in the army and in the city based on merit, Eros Uranios in the second speech becomes the promoter of true democracy in the sense of political freedom achieved through moral courage against tyranny. Thus, Eros tyrannocide is opposed to lack of Eros between citizens out of fear in the barbarian regimes. And now, as a present to Cecilia, I will refer to the part let me say that in Eryximachus' speech, which follows Pausanias' distinction between the two, which leads Phaedra to committing suicide, is treated in purely physiological terms. Bad Eros between the elements causes illness in the body because of the tyranny of one element over the others, as it is the case with the seasons in the cosmos. Now, harmony between the elements leads to euphrasia, which is opposed to the definition of female nature in the Hippolytus as an uneasy harmony, as we have seen. The idea of Eros as a tyrant and a despot in Euripides is cured by the idea of harmony and balance in Plato. Moreover, Socrates' first reaction to Agathon's speech, which follows Aristophanes' speech, plays with the inferences of the idea of Eros as a dynastes, which takes us inevitably to Gorgias' praise of Helen, especially since the Symposium, as a logodenon, begins with Phaedra's suggestion that nobody has ever composed an appropriate praise for god Eros, though there are praises for everybody, even for Helen, who is to blame for the Trojan War. I quote, "For his speech so reminded me of Gorgias that I was exactly in the plight described by Homer. I feared that Agathon in his final phrases would confront me with the eloquent Gorgias's head, and by opposing his speech to mine, would turn me thus dumbfounded into stone. And so in that moment, I realized what a ridiculous fool I was to fall in with your proposal that I should make my turn in your eulogies of love." Now, although the play between Gorgias' name and Gorgon's head seems like an easy slip of tongue, it would not have been appropriate had it not been for another Euripides tragedy, namely Dictys, the protector of Perseus. And that's why there is an association between Gorgias and Gorgon's head, because of this tragedy by Euripides. Now, although the play is only saved in fragmentary fashion, there is a very important fragment which strikes as a direct imitation of Gorgias' famous line about Logos being the dynastis of all things, although in Dictys' case, Eros takes Logos' place most eloquently. Now, these fragments are explored by Patrick Finglas, and this is his quote, "This book demonstrates the significance of a newly discovered papyrus for our understanding of Greek tragedy and its ancient reception. After setting out the mythological context and offering a text and translation, the book analyzes the light which the papyrus sheds on Danae and Dictys, whose narrative centered around ultimately successful female resistant to abusive male tyrants, speak as powerfully to us today as they did to the original ancient audiences. The book proceeds to investigate Euripides' tragic trip 31 BC, which ended with Dictys and began with Medea, a notorious drama in trilogy and today's most famous play, with brilliance now stands in sharper focus given our significantly improved understanding of the context in which it originally appeared. Last but not least, Socrates will begin his speech by using almost the same words Eryximachus used at the very beginning of the dialogue. However, this time it is not Melanippe the wise, but Diotima, the sophist par excellence, as Socrates called her at the end of the speech, who will utter the final words. Okay, end of my text.
Okay. Finished. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sylvana. And I will, as you are doing in all the sessions, we are going to have Konstan talk now, and after it, we have the discussion and the comment by Fernando. Thanks a lot. Konstan, please.
All right, I can be heard. I will try to share my screen, and let's hope that I am successful. This looks like it. Tell me whether you can see it clearly. Can my screen be seen? Oops.
Not yet.
Not yet? It says I'm sharing the screen.
It says that you have started.
Let me see, but there also seems to be a, one moment, let me stop the share. Oops, something has happened. Now it should be all right.
Yes.
You see it? Very good. Okay. Everyone has said it is a great honor to be invited to participate in this session. I have enjoyed so many of the talks, and in fact, we'll be referring to a couple of them. Let me just alert you to the fact that this talk will be short and a little boring. I hope that isn't going to put everyone to sleep, but it may be welcome to be a little boring at this point. Now, my title, which is Socrates' Rhetoric of Anti-Rhetoric, alludes to an ingenious article by the Italian linguist, critic, and lexicographer Paolo Valesio, which was published a long time ago, on King Lear. Now, King Lear, when he was old, proposed to divide his kingdom, among his 3 daughters. And he asked each of them to profess their love for him. Now, the older sisters, Regan and Goneril, are effusive. So Goneril says, I love you more than words can wield the matter, dearer than eyesight, space, and liberty. And her sister, confess myself an enemy to all other joys, which the most precious square of sense possesses. I find I am alone, felicitate, that means happy, in your dear highness's love. Now, this leaves the youngest sister, Cordelia, and she says, silently, my love's richer than my tongue. In other words, she loves more than she can express. And at first she says she has nothing to say. And then when her father pushes her, she says, I love your majesty, her father, according to my bond, nor more nor less. Now, King Lear is upset by this cold response in comparison to her sisters. And so she says, you have begot me, bred me, loved me, to her father. I return those duties back as are right fit. I obey you, love you, and most honor you. But why have my sisters husbands if they say they love you all? Don't they love their husbands if they love him so much? King Lear wants more gushing devotion, and he says to his daughter, so young and so untender. And she answers, so young, my lord, and true. And King Lear says, let it be so, thy truth then be thy dower. In other words, you will get inheritance of nothing from me. You'll be content with your truth. Now, critics have been almost unanimous in seeing in the speech of the sisters a contrast between the elder sisters' rhetoric, now in the negative sense that Plato gave rhetoric, and the sincerity of Cordelia, who speaks from the heart. And notice her name, Cordelia, from the heart, the core. Valesio, however, demonstrated that handbooks of rhetoric in Shakespeare's own time recognized a style that was designed to convey authentic feeling precisely by its simplicity, which lent the appearance of an unmediated expression of inner sentiment. In other words, Cordelia's modest and straightforward manner is no less rhetorical than the effusions of Goneril and Regan. Cordelia too wants to persuade. She only differs from her sisters in her style and strategy. Now, it doesn't work. King Lear prefers the older sisters to his ruin, but this doesn't mean that Cordelia is less rhetorical than the others. This was the point of Valesius. Now, the application of Valesio's insight to the case of Socrates is evident. In light of Plato's attack on the rhetoricians of his time in the Gorgias and elsewhere, scholars have seen his representation of Socrates as artlessness and sincerity, like that of Cordelia, and her commitment to speaking the truth rather than resort to disingenuous manipulation. Livio Rossetti, our hero in the study of Socrates, has described the prevailing view elegantly. He says, Plato, along with Xenophon, I'm trying to speak like Livio now, emphasized Socrates' anti-rhetorical attitudes. Time and again, he tells us that rhetoric characterized quite a different kind of people, the sophists, while Socrates made it a point of honor to unmask the lack of knowledge hidden behind their seeming wisdom and skillfulness. So this is the common view. The best known instance of Socrates' self-deprecating irony is the beginning of his apology in Plato's version, in which he rejects the claim that he's a good or formidable speaker. And he says, I would call myself an orator only if that means you simply tell the truth. But he denies that his language is prettified or adorned like that of his opponents. Now, in doing just this, in making this statement, Socrates is using a very common formula among defendants, which is always to say we don't speak well. And why? Because we have never had the occasion to appear in court before. We are good people. Now, Rossetti ascribes to Socrates as well a more original technique, developed in contrast to that of the sophists, who favored long, elaborate speeches. And here's what Livio says. Socrates opted for a different approach, the unassuming tone, the abolition of long speeches, the disarming simplicity of his remarks, questions, and analogies. Clearly, he thought up a new formula, a new key for breeding confidence in a potential audience. And this is genuine rhetoric, or more precisely, a kind of anti-rhetorical rhetoric. In other words, just like what Paolo Valesio was ascribing to Cordelia. Now, even in the Gorgias, which is Socrates' main attack on rhetoric, it has been argued that Socrates employs a rhetoric of his own and that he considers it a techne. Henry Tello, in a recent article, says, and I quote him, Socrates extensively uses rhetoric in the Gorgias. In fact, it's reasonable to categorize a large part of what Socrates does in that dialogue as rhetorical. Apart from the use of analogies, which Rossetti has already highlighted, Tello warns that we shouldn't be misled by an apparent distinction between dialectic, which is exhibited in Socrates' practice of asking short questions and insisting on brief responses, and the longer discourses characteristic of the rhetoricians. We shouldn't make that distinction, and I'm going to come back to that. However, as Tello says, Socrates asks many questions at once, and he talks at length as if giving a speech. In other words, when you ask one question after another, it adds up to one long speech. So it's not so different as you would think. And Tello concludes, Socrates is not a dispassionate inquirer and receives uncoerced answers, but rather a passionate manipulator who persuasively coerces his interlocutors into assenting to certain views. Well, I may mention here an elegant talk yesterday by Andreas Seraphim on Socrates' interrogative rhetoric. That is exactly what he showed us. But I would like to suggest, and I finally come to my own point, a further dimension of Socrates' deployment of rhetoric, showing that he avails himself of stylistic patterns self-consciously exploited by the leading orators of his day. And this is a supplement to his usual practice of elenchus, or interrogation of his opponent's views. So let me just state very clearly what I'm going to prove very briefly. I'm going to show that Socrates does use rhetoric. And now not the rhetoric of questions, not the rhetoric of analogies, not the rhetoric of the elenchus, but standard Demosthenic rhetoric, that he doesn't use it always, but he can when he wants to. I see that. So in what follows, I'm going to look at two texts. The first is in the fourth book of Xenophon's Memorabilia, and the second looks at Plato's Lysis. So let's look at the Memorabilia. And here's where I say it's going to get really dull. Here we find Socrates is working to attract the attention of a young man named Euthydemus, who prides himself on all that he has learned from books and believes that he has no need of living teachers. Through a series of probing questions, Socrates demonstrates that the boy is in fact ignorant in respect to the most fundamental moral questions, to the point that Euthydemus is left in utter despair. As a result, Socrates, according to Xenophon, stopped upsetting Euthydemus, and proceeded to explain to him in the simplest and clearest way what he thought a person ought to know and the best way to behave. And at this point, Socrates switches to a different mode of discourse, abandoning his usual habit of interrogation and launching upon a proper disquisition, even though here too he intersperses his lecture with questions. Now, here is one rather complex sentence which forms part of Socrates' elaborate theodicy, according to which the universe is fashioned for the benefit of human beings. Now, I'm going to just show you the Greek briefly. There it is. And I'm going to read the English, this is a Socrates sentence. The sun, when past the winter solstice, approaches, ripening some things and withering others, whose time is over. And having accomplished this, approaches no nearer, but turns away, careful not to harm us by excess of heat. And when once again, in his retreat, he reaches the point where it is clear to ourselves that if he goes further away, we shall be frozen with cold, back he turns once more and draws near and revolves in that region of the heavens where he can best serve us. Now, that's a big sentence. The balance clauses form a complex network, and I'm going to just look at the diagram very quickly so you can get a picture of how it works. One, the sun, little one, when past the winter solstice, approaches, A, ripening some things, and B, withering other whose time is over. And two, having accomplished this, approaches no nearer, boom, but turns away, careful not to harm us. And now comes section 2, and 1 prime, when once again in his retreat he reaches the point that A prime, if he goes further, B, we shall be frozen with cold, 2 prime, back he turns and draws once more near, and 3, and revolves in that region of the heavens where he can best serve us. So what I'm trying to suggest here in this sentence is that the major divisions are the sun's approach, its retreat, and its general revolution, 1, 2, and 3. Each of the first two segments is further subdivided. In one, the summer approaches, then withdraws. Section 1 is divided as the sun both ripens some things and drives out others. In 2, the winter sun withdraws and then returns. And again, 1 is divided, this time in the form of a conditional with a protasis. If he goes further away, and then a protasis, we shall be frozen. And there's a further symmetry, slightly off kilter, unbalanced in the emphasis of the sun's care, neither to burn us in summer nor freeze us in winter, with a variation introduced by the clause where it is clear to ourselves to maintain the focus on the benefit of this arrangement to humanity. Now, what I've just done may seem like an excessive exercise in parsing and explaining what is just common Greek sentence structure. But if we think of rhetoric the way the Greeks did, this is exactly what rhetoric is. So by way of comparison, I'm going to take the elaborate opening sentence in Demosthenes' First Philippic, a speech that was much admired in antiquity. In fact, that opening sentence is quoted by several ancient critics. And it was the subject of an entire modern commentary, a rhetorical commentary on this speech by Cecil Wooten. And here is the speech, or just the opening sentence. And you'll see what I mean. If in the question before us were a new one, if the question before us were a new one, men of Athens, I should have waited until most of the regular speakers had delivered their opinion. And if satisfied with their proposals, I should have remained silent. But if not satisfied, I should then have tried to express my own views. Since, however, it is our fortune to be still debating a point on which they have often spoken before, I can safely claim your indulgence if I am the first to rise and address you, for in the past their advice had been sound. If that had been the case, there would be no need for deliberation today. Now, we've all encountered a Demosthenes sentence and a Demosthenes prologue, and it does make you tremble. Them takes his breath away. It does like nothing else, and he can't imagine what it would have been like, he says himself, to have heard it, to have been in the audience. But this is the way they look. Sentences just like that. Wooten devotes several pages to examining the complex structure of this proem. He remarks on its elaborately rhetorical nature, noting more especially Demosthenes' tendency to use complex sentences that rely on repetition, contrastive argument, and suspense in order to highlight those ideas that are important to the orator. Wooten cites Hermogenes' treatise on style, where Hermogenes calls this type of sentence as being a division, which consists of a thought that is divided into two or more parts. On the one hand, this student is bright. On the other hand, he is lazy. That's Hermogenes. Hermogenes points out further that it's possible to have divisions within divisions. And he cites this sentence of Demosthenes to show how it works. In the treatise on invention ascribed to Hermogenes, we see the same sentence described as an antitheton, a figure of thought that places side by side a hypothetical protasis and hypothesis in this and the same structure, referring to an actual situation. And he calls this is the most convincing device there is. This is the best. And several others do this as well. So, having gotten this far, with your attention riveted, let's turn to another such complex period in the Lysis. And it'll emerge too that this speech betrays many of the same features that so struck the admirers of Demosthenes. And what's interesting is that this complex sentence that I'm about to mention comes at the end of an elenchus. And I'm going to argue, but not here, unfortunately, I can't give you all the evidence. But what I want to suggest is that the elenchus isn't quite good enough. It doesn't get the whole point across. And so when Socrates comes to summing up, what does he do? He uses a Demosthenes type structure of a speech to clinch the point. So I'm claiming that he does so to conceal or gloss over a kind of slippage in the preceding demonstration. The apparently rigorous and logical structure of complex sentences, like the ones Demosthenes used, carries a persuasive force of its own, as it sums up the several premises that collectively establish the conclusion. Now, the Lysis is one of Socrates' most simple, Plato's most simple dialogues. But look at this sentence here. With regard to matters in which we become intelligent, everyone will entrust us with them, whether Greeks or foreigners, men or women, and in such matters we shall do as we please, and nobody, but rather not only shall we ourselves be free and have control of others in these affairs, but they will also belong to us, since we will derive advantage from them, whereas in all those for which we have failed to acquire intelligence, so far will anyone be from permitting us to deal with them as we think fit, that everybody will do the utmost to obstruct us, not merely strangers, but father and mother and any more intimate person than they, and we on our part will be subject to others in such matters which will be alien to us, since we will draw no advantage from them. Now, this is a mouthful of a sentence. If I were to write this sentence on a term page, if one of my students were to write a sentence like this, I would divide it into 5. This is current English. We don't write these sentences. But the elegant set of antitheses and divisions within divisions stands out clearly in a way worthy of Demosthenes. So much so that you really don't need a diagram, but just for the sake of comparison, I'll just throw it in here. So you get 1, with regard to matters in which we become intelligent. Little 1, everyone will entrust us. A, whether Greeks or foreigners. B, men or women. A prime, and in such matters we do as we please. B prime, and nobody will care to obstruct us. 2, but rather. C, not only shall we be free. D, but we'll have control of others. D prime, and so on and so forth. All through it. I don't go through all of it, but you heard it, and you could feel the, I'm admitting another speaker. You can feel the intensity of the rhetoric, just hearing it. And of course, I have confessed, last semester I taught this to an intermediate Greek class, and this is just where they have the problems. They're getting through the whole thing. So I'm summing up here that little things that he's done, and I'm really right at the end of my talk now. Plato has neatly varied the symmetrical structure, introducing a result clause in place of the earlier antithesis, postponing a counterpart till the end of the series. All of this happens, and on a close analysis, we can work it out very easily. My main point is it is a resounding wrap-up of that must surely have daunted the young Lysis. Here's this young boy, probably 12 or 13 years old, fascinated with Socrates. Socrates has been giving him all these lessons about how his parents, would your parents love you? That's the basic argument of the Lysis. Do your parents love you? Yes. Well, if they love you, then they must let you do everything you like to do, because loving, they want you to be happy. And to be happy, you have to do anything you want to do. And Lysis says, yes, but do they let you do anything you want to do? No, they don't let me do everything I want to do. So, or they don't want to make you happy, or they don't love you. That's the nature of the argument. And when he comes to the very end, this is the big wrap up, the big conclusion that Socrates offers. So then, why turn suddenly to a highly rhetorical style? Socrates, whom we think of as the opposite pole of a Gorgias or a Protagoras, such as Protagoras is represented, let's say, in the dialogue about him. Now, I can't set out the reasons fully in this time, but I wish to suggest that these passages come precisely at the point where the elenchus seems to fail or to be insufficient. Socrates brings his interlocutors to a certain point of doubt and confusion. But then what? Are his challenges and cross-examinations enough to persuade or to enlighten? Socrates very often caps his debates with fulsome rhetorical conclusions, such as the ones we have examined, which serve to persuade by sheer rhetorical force where other methods leave off. I may compare it to Socrates' use of myths, where the very figure who has abjured fiction and stories, he says he's never going to use fictions and stories, nevertheless resorts to just such inventions to help his listeners see the point, as Alessandro Stavru showed so elegantly yesterday. Socrates was a poet, and I would add, a rhetorician as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Konstan. And I already have some questions, but I will give the floor to Fernando, the respondent, to to comment the two sessions, the two talks. Sorry. I'm a bit tired.
Querida Cecília, estou muito feliz com esse simpósio que você organizou e que chega agora ao final de uma maneira tão bela e entusiasmada, com falas tão ricas e que não apenas nos enriquecem de conhecimento, mas nos fazem sorver o prazer da amizade, do amor, da beleza poética. So I'm very, very glad to be here with David and Sylvana. Sylvana, I can see you and hear, and David, I can see and hear both of you. Even I cannot touch and drink really with you. I prefer to drink, and I invite you to drink every time you come to Brazil, and I invite you as well to go to the next Dionisiaca in Sambuca, Sicilia, the third Dionisiaca. Sylvana knows what it is. David and Cecilia, you all must know too. It's a festival with theater, poetry, philosophy, and wine. Every time, much wine. We start with a harvest, and we finish drinking, and we drink every time to have more brilliant thinkers like you. So my questions and my points for your texts, in fact, first for Sylvana, is for how to do a symposium, how to do symposia. That's interests me, and I think that's interests everybody who wants to drink and to make philosophy drinking. Cecilia, you put the hand up.
No, I just put my hand, but it's after your comment.
Okay, but you can interrupt anytime.
Alessandro. Okay.
Yes.
No, but it's later.
So my interest in your speech, Sylvana, is in the way to do a very well philosophic symposium. So, and I choose a verse, a Xenophanes verse, answering this question. When he says, he writes, Euphemos mythos kai kataros si logos. How to do good symposium with Euphemos mythos kai kataros si logos. With good mythos stories, I don't know, and pure kataros speeches, logos. So this is a formula, and very interesting, because we have in this formula what we understand by poetry and philosophy. But I don't know if what we first understand by mythos as poetry and logos as philosophy is a good translation for what Xenophanes says. But this is there is this order. And I remember another kind of explanation, which is in the opposite. It's inverse. First, experience and a philosophical sentence, and after the myth. I'm referring of the Sappho's Tithonius poem, where she's teaching the girls, and she said, I'm getting old, and she shows herself getting old by her white hair, and she made a statement, a philosophical sentence: no human can run of age and getting old. That's logos, very philosophical logos. And after she tells the Tithonius myth. So first she tells the logos, and after the myth. And I understand this is how to teach for children the myths. But in the Symposium, we are not teaching, because we are adults. We are getting pleasure. We are drinking. So we start with poetry, and after logoi. So my question for Sylvana is just, Sylvana, how you think we must do our next symposium, and first poetry and after philosophy, or first philosophy and after poetry? But for this question, I want to bring some problems, because I think there is really a translation problem when I said just mythos are poems or poetry and logos are philosophy, because there is the adjectives, the epithets, not just mythos, but euphemos mythos, and not just logos, but katharoisi logos. So what really are euphemos mythos and katharoisi logos? Maybe my really question to you: why use euphemos and why use katharos for logos? Yes, I think this brings the soul of your text, which is the intertextuality with dramatic poetry and philosophy, and the not just the literary performance, but the symbolic performance itself. So this is my question for Sylvana. for David, I'm very happy for the point of thinking about short and simple speeches. I think this is the real secret of politics. I think when we start to understand this very hard problem of simple, short, and clever speeches, maybe we can understand a bit of what happens in the entire world in these times, especially in Brazil. In Brazil, we are ruled by very short words, by simple words. I don't know if they are clever as Socratic words, but they are cogent, very cogent. So I'm very scared with the power of simple words, of the rhetoric power, of the rhetoric and political power of simple words. And I'm very glad that you brought us this problem, because I think we must know how to do it more and more. And we, as classicists, right, or as academics, we are not very short speakers. We love to speak long and long and long. We are epic thinkers, not very. We are not very good joke makers, but I think we must learn this kind of speech. But I want to go into the Socratic problem you brought us, the Socratic problem about the short speech and the rhetoric of the simple speech. But I first want to separate something and make clear that we are dealing with Plato texts and other texts. We use to analyze Socrates' speech, what Plato wrote. And Plato is a writer, and Socrates, it's not a writer, it's a street speaker. He speaks fast, short, clever in the street, maybe in a sympathetic speech. He is not so short as usual in the streets. Maybe Plato's right to characterize him as a very good rhetorician, even in long speech, as in the Symposium. But there is two Socrates. Socrates, oral Socrates, that we don't know who was him, and the Platonic Socrates, which sometimes he wrote short speeches, with questions and short answers and short examples, and a pedagogy very simple. But sometimes he has long periods and long speeches, because Plato is a very, very good writer, and he must make Socrates the more intelligent and the more clever he can in short and long speeches. So my point, not only how Plato pretends in an anti-rhetoric way to imitate the simple anti-rhetoric of Socrates, but how this short rhetoric can be cogent, even it's not clever, like the anti-rhetoric of our Brazilian politicians, which I refuse to name because I don't want to have my tongue dirty. So that's my questions for you both, and I express again how I'm happy to hear you.
Muito obrigada, Fernando. Thank you, Fernando. I will give the floor to Sylvana and Konstan, and we have 6 people in the line. So there is a lot of more questions. I just ask to everyone now to be a bit brief. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernando. I'm used to speaking in French with Fernando. It's a bit strange for me now to speak in English with him.
I forgot to ask forgiving for my ugliest English, my bad English, my wild English.
You're a good poet because I have. No, I mean you are a great poet, and everybody knows it, especially in Brazil. And since you're a great poet, you can understand what I have to say. Well, the reason why I try to account for the symposium through the elegy is because I found out many common points between the two texts. What do I mean by that? First, they are both quite revolutionary in the sense that there is no drinking contest, but rather a rhetorical one, as we said. And but this is not the most important similarity between the two. What you suggested as the most important similarity, namely that all speeches are bipartite, ephimoi, mythoi on the one hand, and katharoi, logoi on the other, which is a suggestion by, and they promote arete, and they come from Mnemosyne. We also have to take into account this, and they also involve men who are praisable. The men themselves are praisable, not only the God to be praised. And this is another element which is important. It goes back to Xenophanes' ideas as a whole, because okay, we all know the criticism against the epic myths. So ephimi mythoi are the myths which are not prompted by the epic poets, and which give a very deceptive image of the gods, and of the gods as being deceptive. Okay, so Ephimi mythoi should be mythoi who are in favor of God's fame, okay, in that sense. Now, the second part, when it has to do with the katharoi logoi, I think that it has to do with the process of purification, katharoi in the sense of pure, but which comes after a process of purification. And this process of purification is something which is suggested by Xenophanes' critique. I cannot analyze it now, but what I'm trying to say is that his critique against the epic poets is what clarifies the image to be rendered to God. And that's why I believe that in the first speech by Phaedrus, which follows upon this example, which is suggested by Xenophanes, we may find this monistic view about God, which is the case in Xenophanes' hexametric verses on this Hellenistic way of describing God. And this God is the result of the purification of the genealogical myths that he criticizes. Let me give you an example and I will finish by that. If God is born, which is something that Xenophanes appears to consider impious for the first time, that people should not say that gods are born, because if they're born, this means that they die. And this is against logic and against the very nature of God, which is that God is, by definition, eternal. And if God is eternal, then God should not have been born. And if God should not have been born, then we may eliminate all the genealogical myths, and especially the ones promoted by the epic poets, namely the Hesiodic theogony, for instance. Okay, so then we have to come up with different myths. And we have the illustration of that in the Republic, when I referred to this passage yesterday when we were talking with Alessandro Stavru, that Adimantus, when he brings about the whole set of ideas that Xenophanes is known for, he asks Socrates, so how shall we write mythology? And then Socrates responds to him that we should write theology, and this is the first time of the use of the term theology. He coins the word theologia for the first time in this passage. And he says that this theology should be done according to certain typoi. Okay, so it is according to certain, there should be a prescription. We should observe some rules in order to write these myths and to ascribe them to God. We should not ascribe to God any kind of myth just because it pleases us, or because it belongs to tradition, or because it has to do with those authorities of Homer and Hesiod that Xenophanes is so much against. Plato is less against them than Xenophanes and Heraclitus, but still he is trying to observe the rules set by Xenophanes in many places, in the Sophists, in the Republic, in the Laws. I have many passages which suggests that. But this would be the theme of another lecture, so I don't want to go on. Okay, we can discuss about it in Paris.
Okay, I give the word to Konstan.
Thank you, Fernando, for the exciting proposal to put drinking either before or after, according to our preference. I would only answer one point. When you say that Plato is, of course, a great literary artist, and he can put in the mouth of Socrates an elaborate rhetorical kind of diction, this is true, but Xenophon does it too. This doesn't mean that Socrates necessarily was this way, but in a argues is very early, maybe closer to the direct experience of Socrates. What happens there is that Socrates explicitly changes his style of discourse. He says, I am going to abandon the kind of elenchus that upsets a young man and introduce a different kind of speech, which is simple, clear, and continuous without perpetual questions. And so I'm inclined to think, without necessarily ascribing it to Socrates himself, but possibly, that Socrates did acknowledge two different kinds of styles. And then what is interesting is that when he does indulge in a summary or his argument or a finale that is supposed to be conclusive, what we can see is a style very similar to that of Demosthenes. And that's the only point I was making in my talk, that when we think of the anti-rhetorical Socrates, he can be rhetorical in very much the way the ancient writers on style recognized a rhetorical ploy.
Thank you, David. Now, Alessandro, please.
So thank you both, Sylvana and David, for two very learned talks, very convincing, very persuasive, very rhetorical, both of them. I was fascinated by both of them and I learned a lot. So I wrote down a couple of things. So I wanted to pose you a very brief question, trying to be macrologos, if I can, to Sylvana. This distinction between Aphrodite and Artemis, where Aphrodite is ruining everything and Artemis is Sophrosine, is the model of the opposite kind of femininity in a way, is of course very convincing, because of course in Plato this distinction between the two kinds of erotes and Aphrodite is of course very important. But I tried to show in a recent paper, an old paper which I published in English recently, that this distinction between two kinds of Aphrodite, two kinds of erotes, is not only in Plato. You find it in the whole of the Socratics, more or less. You find it in Xenophon, of course, in the Symposium. It's very close to that we read in Plato. You find it in Aeschines, you find it in Antisthenes even. So it's a common issue in Socratic literature. And I'm wondering whether Plato is drawing directly from Euripides, if this is your claim or would be your claim, or if there is some other source in between, some other author or commonplace before coming to Plato, because it's strange that you have it not only in Plato. So I don't think Plato draws on directly from Euripides, but it must have been a common discourse that you had two ways of approaching Eros and Aphrodite and the whole issue about that. So this was my question. Thank you so much for your reference to me at the end of the talk. It was a bit too much, I think. I did not deserve so much, but David, I found very convincing what you said. And my question is, because you, of course, Lysis and Memorabilia 4 is, of course, I mean, you have two sources, two different authors with the same, more or less, topic, the same structure of speech. And Memorabilia 4.2 is an example of Socratic elenchus, one of the most important to me examples of Socratic elenchus. So there you have really a different, a switch of style, which is very evident from the Socratic elenchus to 4.3, where you have this Demosthenes-like passage, so it's very evident what you say. But my question is, would be Antisthenes, who wrote 2 rhetorical speeches, Ajax and Palamedes, would that be also an important set of passages to look at? Because maybe if you add also Antisthenes to your brilliant, I think, I mean, very convincing argument, maybe it's even more clear what you're saying, that you have a rhetorical, Demosthenes-like Socrates behind what we read in Plato, what we find in Xenophon, and then it becomes very difficult to say this is an invention of Plato, because if you find it in many places, then of course it might be something more than just Plato's rhetorical ability. This is it.
Thank you. Sylvana, and then David.
Well, thank you, Alessandro. Well, what I try to stress is not only that point, which, as you observed, is a commonplace, not only concerning Eros, but also concerning Eris and other divinities in the antiquity. So it is a commonplace in general, this duality, these 2 kinds of goddesses. What I try to show is that since Plato points to Euripides when it comes to the theme of the Symposium, praising Eros adequately, and since this theme is raised also in the Hippolytus, I try to develop it further. And one of the points was the duality of the goddess, Aphrodite, not the most important one, but it is quite important in the sense that they represent, as I said, a different kind of reverence. And this is more important than the duality itself. So yes, I agree with you. It does not have, I mean, of course, Hippolytus is not the prototype of such a distinction, but it is very important for the description of a new sense of reverence, which does not have to do with a revengeful Aphrodite as depicted in the tragedy, but with a new kind of Eros, as described in the Symposium. So yes, that was one of the motifs, not the most important, and I agree with you that it is a commonplace in many speeches and in many goddesses, starting with Hesiod. No, okay. Not with Beatles. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, David.
Well, I could answer you, Alessandro, in 2 words. You're right. That makes it easy. Yes, Antisthenes, if I were looking to, I wasn't especially in this talk, but if I were looking to identify Socrates' own style behind it, I think that would be a very important extra text to use. Thank you.
Well, now it's me, Konstan. I'll try to be short. Thank you. It's mainly to Konstan. With Sylvana is a long talk and talk in another moment. But Konstan, I like very much when you comment about this rhetoric of anti-rhetoric. And I remember, I'm sure you know, John Hess in Deception and Democracy. He has a whole chapter on this subject, and it's connected also to tragedy. It's called Rhetoric of Anti-Rhetoric. It's very interesting. And I also just want to say that was very nice to listen to you. I think for my students too, because it's something when I always read Apology, they are confirmed with it. And I stress this rhetoric of spontaneity and some peculiarities, like for instance, in the first paragraph, when Socrates says, if to tell the truth is to be a good rhetorician, then I'm Deinos, I am a good. But at the end of the same paragraph, he transformed a conditional in an affirmative. For a Jude is to Jude well, and for a rhetor is to speak the truth. It's so curious. Many times in Plato, the conditional transform in an affirmative so quickly. But one thing I would like to ask you is if you agree with me, in Apologia, I think Plato do something that Aeschylus, for instance, did in the Agamemnon, and it's very persuasive. Socrates starts saying, oh, I'm fighting with the shadows. Oh, there is a comedy. Oh, there is someone who is a dramaturg, and then he said, oh, it is Aristophanes. In some sense, is similar, I think, with Aeschylus when he starts saying, oh, that woman that went with the winds, that woman who left her husband, and that woman who go away. And when he says Helen, you have already a big back picture that the etymology, that strange but very useful etymology of Helen, it works so well to confirm all this image that you start creating. What do you think? Thank you.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about the sophistication, the use of puns, the use of building up an image that Socrates uses. Socrates, I wonder how many of you have ever seen an American detective show that was called Columbo. And he was very famous in his time, and some of us who are not the very youngest of the group will remember him. And he dressed in very humble clothing. He was a very clever police detective. And his way of talking was as though he was the most ordinary person. Everybody underestimated him. He was the model of Socratic irony. And he would ask various questions and then make to leave. He was just about to walk out the door and he'd turn around and say, oh, one more thing. And that would be the clever question that would upset every one of his interlocutors and make it clear that he understood what was going on. This is the Socrates we know and love. And I only wanted to show that there was this other aspect of Socrates. And since I saw in the chat message a comment from Livio, Livio, I know you came in just a little late, but I referred to you as the maestro, they all who know, che sanno, in when it comes to Socrates. And yes, I did make reference to that paper of yours. I think you're silent, Cecilia.
Maybe you have to read what Livio says about what Livio...
Livio, io chiedo di fare una imitazione di David perché lei ha fatto una imitazione di sì. Ma dopo Andrea, por favor.
I'd like to ask Professor Konstan about something that I'm researching for my master's program. Actually, I want to try to follow the easy way and see if you can answer the question for me. But I research Gorgias, and I find very interesting that in the end of the dialogue, Plato mentions pretty quickly, uncomfortably quickly, the existence of a good rhetoric, a true rhetoric, or as you call in your text, an authentic rhetoric. And that makes my mind blow, because he spends the whole dialogue criticizing rhetoric, showing how it can be paradoxical in the Gorgias Act and then showing that pleasure is not the synonym of a good life in the Callicles Act. And then by the last pages of the Gorgias, he says, well, but there is this thing that I call the true rhetoric, and it can be used to make people better, to put justice in them and take vice away. But he doesn't explain it in detail. He spends most of the dialogue talking about the bad rhetoric, the rhetoric associated with the sophists, but he spends almost no time talking about the true rhetoric. So I really, really, really want to know from you, what do you think what's the meaning of this true rhetoric? Is it almost as if Plato is preparing ground for the Phaedrus, where he will talk better about this good rhetoric? Or is it something like, oh no, this is an ideal kind of rhetoric, we can only think about it, we cannot practice it? Or is it Plato or Socrates or someone saying, oh, there is a good rhetoric and I actually used it throughout all the dialogue, and here it is me, myself admitting that I did that. All that things that you learned here were not only through questioning, but I used the right kind of rhetoric, and here is my time to say, well, it exists and I'm expliciting it out. So thank you, Professor.
Well, it's an excellent question, Andre, and I would only say that it's possible that the rhetoric he's referring to is the very set of devices that he himself uses to approach the truth. And in this respect, just that little passage I quoted from Livio Rossetti at the beginning of my talk illustrates that this is that alternative kind of rhetoric, but is a rhetoric of its own. It has a structure, it has techniques, it has devices, but they differ from the usual orator's repertoire. If this is the case, then the only contribution I was making was to suggest that Socrates also has the other type as at his disposal.
Thank you. Cecilia, you are muted, teacher, professor.
May I say a word? Yes.
You're muted. You're muted, Cecilia.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry. No, I'm just saying I will give the word to Will, but just saying to David that I will call you for my student master committee in the future. Andre, thank you. Will, please, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Cecilia. Just a word to Andre. You might be interested in reading Aelius Aristides on the Four, which deals with the exact question that you have raised and has just appeared in a new Loeb Library classic translated by Michael Trapp. It deals specifically with this question. David, when you attributed standard demosthetic rhetoric to Socrates, this was music to my ears, and I want to ask you about that. I don't think we discussed it, but after that Xenophon book, I wrote a book on Demosthenes and Plato, in which I'm arguing that the ancient evidence that Demosthenes was Plato's student at the Academy needs to be revived. This seems to me to be a way to get around the obvious anachronism of saying that Socrates is using Demosthenic rhetoric, since Demosthenes was, like Aristotle, was born 15 years after Socrates was lynched. So this is what I want to ask you about, David, is since you're obvious, Cecil Wooten, for example, played a role in my book, and I'm examining the rhetoric of Demosthenes in a less anachronistic fashion. In other words, I'm saying that he owes his mastery of rhetoric to what he learned from Plato's dialogues in the Academy. And by the way, that's why I mentioned Aelius Aristides, because Aelius Aristides pretends that he's criticizing Plato because Plato is attacking rhetoric, but Aelius Aristides brings out all of the passages in the Gorgias, like the ones that Andre mentioned, and including the one he didn't about Aristides the Just, which suggests there is a good rhetoric and that Plato knows it perfectly well. And of course, that if he was Demosthenes' teacher, he's teaching that good rhetoric to Demosthenes. So, I mean, David, we've talked about a lot of things, but I kind of regret that I didn't send my manuscript to you. What do you think about the idea of Demosthenes as being a student of Plato's?
That's a big one, and I'm going to have to think hard about it. As with everything, I'm going to look at all the evidence you bring together and going to read it with great care, because it is certainly what would help to explain some of the coincidence in style.
Thanks, David.
Okay, thanks. Fred, please. I just remembered that Fred put also some comments on the chat, and if you want to read. But Fred, please, and first of all, your microphone, Fred.
Yes, there are things that worried me about both presentations today, even though I enjoyed a great deal of them. The first was David's comment about rhetoric and poetry. In the first place, I'd like either of our speakers to tell us who talked about the quarrel between poetry and philosophy before Plato and Socrates. Did anyone? Or is this in fact their invention? And Parmenides happily wrote in poetry and was not alone in so doing. And in his antitheses between the way of truth, aletheia, and the way we tend to translate it opinion rather than belief, because we don't like to get in trouble with the church, or people didn't. But orthodoxa is what you have to believe, or you go to the stake and get fried in medieval and Renaissance times. And the question as to what aletheia means, and David used the meaning truth, but it's absolutely critical to understanding Plato's Republic, Book 10, that you understand that Socrates is applying the notion of thea ali, the anagram, a divine wandering, to explain aletheia, as he does in Cratylus, and that Diotima is using the sort of aletheia, the absence of forgetfulness understanding, and neither of which corresponds to truth in English, since truth is a belief word in English. You can establish the truth by religious belief, whereas the whole point of Parmenides was that doxa is completely and fundamentally opposed to aletheia. And so the way we translate has a terrible effect on how we understand, because we understand through the vernacular translations rather than through our originals. And this becomes particularly true when we look at poetry, because it is almost the rule of thumb in poetry that you translate an original into whatever is the fashionable meter in your vernacular language, regardless of the meter of the original. And that was put out in so many words by Jury Levy in the 1950s, and certainly seems to be followed. So it's okay to strip part of the semantics of poetry, that is the metrics, away. The second point on that, again, is the use of the term Socratic irony. The general meaning of ironia in Greek is the affectation, as Theophrastus says, of the lesser in word and in deed. In other words, that Socratic irony is irony. Our notion of irony is different. But that doesn't mean to say that ironia is particularly a Socratic phenomenon. I'd call to your attention the fact that the Romans translate ironia by dissimulatio, which is the pretense of being something less than what you are, the affectation of the lesser, just as Theophrastus says. Now, this business of the affectation of the lesser is important to poetry as well. It's what Odysseus does with his disguise. It's also what happens in the rhetorical phenomenon of emphasis, which is, as again with Quintilian's words, which are easier to define, it is leaving aliud latens, something latent, auditori quasi inveniendum. And well, the example given to illustrate that is from Plato's Phaedo, where the question is raised as to where Cleombrotus and Aristippus were at the time of Socrates' death. The answer comes, they were in Aegina. And as the writer of the On Style points out, that Aegina was just a short ride from Athens and they could easily have made it. But the condemnation, and he calls it lidoria, the abuse, is just in answering two simple words. They were in Aegina, because people will put together the answer for themselves. And as Quintilian points out, the judge is most likely to suspect as being true what he thinks we didn't intend to say. So there's a whole complex process here, and it isn't reversed. Now, while I absolutely agree with David that there is the poet in the philosopher, Socrates is indeed a poet, that we do not apply the criteria of poetry to reading philosophy, and vice versa, we don't apply the criteria of reading poetry to reading philosophy. So when in Sophocles' Oedipus, for example, the chorus introduces Tiresias as ho exellenxon ton phonea, the person who's going to cross-question and examine the killer, brings in Tiresias, who then cross-questions, although the cross-questioning is supposed to be the other way around, he cross-questions Oedipus and does refute him. A scene that begins with Oedipus trying to stop Tiresias from leaving ends with Tiresias ordering Oedipus off stage. It is a rhetorical triumph for Tiresias, but everyone employs the criteria of belief, namely that Tiresias is a priest and is therefore telling the truth, which is a very unsafe assumption to make, as we know from recent investigations into church activities. So that therefore also raises the question about what's going on in Euripides' Hippolytus, because it's all very well to talk about two Aphrodites, but there are two Artemises which are in conflict. There's the Artemis of chastity and the Artemis of childbirth. With one or two exceptions, one doesn't give birth if one is a virgin. Parthenogenesis is an unusual and rare phenomenon. And the point really is that Artemis should be as insulted by Hippolytus as Aphrodite is, because in the great speech, that hideously great speech, O zev tidi kivdilon anthropis kakon yenekas, as fosilio katokisas, igar vrotion iteles spira genos uk ek ginechon chryparaskaste tade, al antithetas soisinena ois vrotus e chrison e sidiron e chalku varos pedon priaste sperma tuti bimbatos axias ekastut, and nayen eleftherosi thelion ater. The guy hates women, females. He doesn't want to have the sex. He wants you to be able to go in and put down your money to get your children, but depending on what you have. And why would the goddess of childbirth be that keen to support him? Well, she isn't really. She's just keen to make sure that she gets one of Aphrodite's people in compensation. And similarly, at the end of the play, when Theseus, having been informed what has happened, tries to make things up to the scattered and dying Hippolytus, Hippolytus's last words are, Tionde pedon gnision evhutichin. Pray that you may have such sons as me, born legitimately, because he knows he's only been dismissed because he's nothos, because he's a counterfeit coin, a bastard. And these are rhetorical as well as poetical structures. And the kind of detail in which we examine a rhetorical text needs also to be applied to poetic as well as to philosophical texts. And I sense that this isn't being done because the wordplay in Plato is traditionally not dealt with. I haven't seen a translation of the Republic in any language that I've looked at in which aletheia is translated as anything other than by the vernacular word, which we in English have as truth. So we are letting everything be governed by a totally alien set of criteria. Okay, sorry, I'll shut up. But I'd like to see if there's any response to that from our speakers.
Thank you, Fred, for this emphatic question and reading also. Please, David and Sylvana.
Well, I go briefly at the hour. I would just point on a kind of aside. I wrote a paper not so long ago, which is available online, in fact, called Homer Answers His Critics. And the thrust of the argument was that just as Homeric epic has a long history, we think hundreds of years, Kenneth Oldfield argued
sorry, someone let the, no, it's okay. Someone let the microphone.
Yes, I saw what happened. Yes. And just as Kenneth Dover argued that we should also think that lyric and elegy have a long history going back, why don't we assume that the kind of poetry that Parmenides and Xenophanes wrote also has a long.
Exactly.
Miriam, you want to turn off your. The interaction between epic and critical verse could have hundreds of years history. And in that respect, I think there's a kind of quarrel going on, but it's a quarrel that's self-conscious among the poets who adopt different styles and different rhetorics with one another, and that Homer was fully aware of the kind of criticism that Xenophanes and others had to offer. That's my very partial reply.
Yeah, Jack Peridotto made that point too in his Man in the Middle Voice. Yeah.
Well, I remember the book, but I'd forgotten that part. So thank you, Fred, for that. And I'll pass it now over to Sylvana.
One would need to give a very elaborate answer to your question. I totally agree with you that Xenophanes, Parmenides, and Empedocles, most of all, have been brilliant poets. Empedocles, I mean, he is as good as Homer. When it comes to the criticism of epic poetry by Xenophanes, for instance, I will not concentrate on those verses everybody knows. I will concentrate on something which might be a critique against this notion of aletheia that you mentioned in Hesiod. There is a part of a verse which is ascribed to Xenophanes, which says that toita δεδοικότα tois ετίμοισιν, something resembling truth. So we have a combination of the doxa in a way and ετίμοισιν, the truth that we may find in the Proemion in Hesiod. Okay, according to my interpretation, Xenophanes comes up with an intermediate notion between doxa and aletheia. It is a doxa which resembles the etimoisin, so the aletheia in a way. And so it is as if he constructs a ladder of understanding, and one can understand. I think that this is in accordance with all his epistemological fragments that you may remember of. What I'm trying to say is that things are not as rigid, as they seem to be in Parmenides, where it's this distinction between doxa.
No, I'm not saying it is generally. I'm just saying that the point is that Parmenides makes that his contrast, that is between the way of aletheia and the way of doxa. And that we also try to get away from doxa as belief, even though that this is the commonest real meaning in English, I think, for doxa, as established in modern usage. But you see, the other point that is really disturbing is if you got...
Doxa is not belief; it's seemingness. It's the how things
I mean, for instance, orthodoxa is correct opinion.
Orthodoxa is a correct opinion, yes, but the way
is a correct belief.
Doxa is how things appear
Yeah,
be,
but it's evoxeti vuli ketodimoi. It seems right. It is believed by the Senate, by the Vuli and the people. It's just that we have been steered from this by years of Christian insistence that belief is an avenue to truth, which is an avenue that by and large in ancient times wasn't. But the point I'm getting at too is that when you look at something like Aletheia, you look at book 14 of the Odyssey, when Odysseus is talking to Eumaeus, and he talks about, oh, how things I have learned, hossa alethin. And alethin is from alaome, to wander. And then Eumaeus replies, well, all of you people who are alete, that you all lie. Someone who's traveled comes in and tells lies which don't convince anyone. But the idea of a dialogue going on in the Odyssey between a person attempting to make a pun between with a word that in one sense could mean true, but he's using the word from alaome, to wander, alethin, but it's taken and understood to be an inference that the wanderer tells the truth. And this is the kind of usage of language which people just totally ignore when they're translating. And as a translator looking at translation, I see this all the time. I see that every English commentator now who writes about Plato uses essentially, and guys, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it's the sort of Gruber translation English of what tends to be the dominant one, whatever his usage is. And the problem with this is that it kills every single wordplay that Plato and Socrates make, every single one. In the same way, yeah, this is the real problem. And this is part of rhetoric too, because rhetoric is the manipulation of multiple meanings of language. And that's what I'm worried about, because I think this is costing us a great deal of meaning, both in poetry and in philosophy.
If you allow me an interruption, perhaps
I'm sorry.
Perhaps you should do a seminar on perhaps Plato and discuss Aletheia, truth, a cause, and the problematic verosimilanza. Perhaps you could do this in the future, because we are already 40 minutes ahead of the planet. But I'm very glad that this symposium and all my students who are here, also all the people who are here, this was so stimulating. Daniela, one of my students, put a question to David. Perhaps I don't know, David, if you want to briefly just to answer her, and then we finish the session and the symposium. Would you like to? Your microphone?
I don't see the question in the chat. I see a comment, but not the question.
Do you want me to read it? I can read it.
Yes,
quickly.
if you would, please.
Yes, I'd like to thank both professors for the great presentations. Firstly, I'm sorry if I get too far from your topic, but I couldn't help but think of the dialogue Parmenides when before your presentation. The way of organizing a speech you presented, the one used by Demosthenes, seems very similar to the character of Parmenides, used in the second part of the dialogue. However, Parmenides presents it as a method to reach knowledge for Socrates to practice, and yet the dialogue has an aporetic ending. In this sense, I was wondering whether I could consider Demosthenes when trying to understand this part of the dialogue, or is it too much of a stretch?
No, it seems like an excellent question. I deliberately limited myself to dialogues that are regarded as very simple. First, a passage in Xenophon, who is always regarded as being much less rhetorically sophisticated than Plato. And then a dialogue like the Lysis is almost uniformly regarded as a very early dialogue. These are questionable hypotheses, whereas later, when you get to something like the Laws, you might expect and do find much more elaborate structures, and no one is equally inclined to see those late dialogues as being having the same Elenchic method or quite the same language and style. So that's why I picked the Lysis. But I think if you're looking to the later dialogues and want to make the point that they are, they represent, and maybe even in an increasingly sophisticated form, the use of this kind of syntax, highly rhetorical, stylized forms of diction that were already in antiquity associated with a very particular style. Then perhaps Will is right that there's a connection between Plato and Demosthenes, and that all of this style was being developed and worked on at just this very period. But you wouldn't be wrong to make it clear that the Parmenides too reflects just such a kind of speech. So I think that's a good idea.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Daniela. Well, I will close this symposium, hoping that in future symposia, we can continue discussing such marvelous text and heritage of the ancient, with also all the reflexive comments that you have from nowadays. And thank you very much, all of you that make it possible, my students for putting this with me together, and all the speakers and all of you that are still here. We hope to put the everything on YouTube, but first of all, you are going to send to each speaker the record in a way they can check if they want to edit something. But you are inform you about the all the YouTube site, the website, the link of the YouTube. Okay. So the only thing I can say is to use, as I use many times,
Ciao David. Ciao Sylvana.
Ciao, ciao.
Mudar-vos quanto tenho e quanto posso, porque quanto mais vos pago, mais vos devo. Abraço.
I will write.
Thank you, Fred, David, Liv, Sylvana, Alessandra. All of you, Celso, Caio. All of you, thank you.
Everybody. Lovely
Good night.
seeing you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
See you
Bye.
soon
Bye.
in peace, hopefully. Ciao, Marco
Ciao.
Antonio. Ciao.
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 Todos,
Bye.
todas.
Ciao.
Καλησπέρα.
Καλησπέρα. Καληνύχτα, yes, to us it's
Ναι.
almost midnight.
Τι ώρα είναι, τι ώρα.
Good night. Thank you.